Missouri since she moved here in 1999. She grew up in Maryland, another Civil War border state, went to college in Washington, D.C., got a master's in German at the University of Wisconsin, a master's of library service at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and worked at Marymount Manhattan College and the Leo Baeck, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Institute, part of the Center of Jewish History in New York City. Rachel has always been interested in our racialized history here in the United States, particularly the roles that everyday actions within social everyday activities or actions, I think, within social and professional life and local government play in perpetuating racist outcomes. Rachel lives with her husband and 3 cats in the East Campus neighborhood on land owned at one time by one of the founders of the League of Women Voters in Columbia, an organization of which she is also a member. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. I've been researching this topic in a little bit by little bit, and I'm happy to say, by the way, that we have a very good recorder of deeds right now who's been very helpful in allowing me electronic access to these documents. Unfortunately, they are not scanned in such a way that I can simply search them. There wasn't money for that when that project was started, but I can at least page through deed books virtually instead of having to go to that office, to the old cold deed room, as I call it. So that's been, yeah, that access has been invaluable for this project. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Let me see, which screen? The one with the PowerPoint. Let's see, where's the PowerPoint? Hello, oh, there it is. Okay, PowerPoint, share. And I guess I'll get it on the view where it's actually a slideshow. Play from start. There we go. Okay, so this is a project, and yeah, and especially since we do have a small group, I will try to hopefully there'll be enough time for at least a little bit of discussion here. I keep adding more material though, so I'll try to get through it relatively quickly. It's about what I call dirty deeds and discriminatory housing here, particularly in this county. And I say it's about the violence of ordinary paperwork because I really am interested in how institutions, whether it's local government or whether it's professional networks like real estate profession and that, how those institutions can combine to sort of push the ball of kind of everyday racism down the hill, sort of make outcomes that are racist more likely in just by the way that they work. And what I mean by that, you'll see more in the presentation. So here's an example. I can read cursive. I'm not that young, but I bet there's a few other people who can read cursive here. So I'd be interested, could somebody read this aloud? This little part in the red box, and I can also see if you're seeing.
I'll try. It is agreed and made a part of the consideration that no, I don't know, can't get that one, commonly
Negro.
called, no what?
I think it says,
No something.
I thought it said Negro with an uncapitalized N.
Okay, yeah. Commonly called colored man shall own or become in possession of any of the above named land for and within the something 5-year to something comes from this date. I'm not doing very well. And should such Negro or colored man become in possession of this land, it is to revert back to the party of the first part on this house. Is that what that says?
Or his heirs.
Or his heirs. Thank you, Sue.
So if this seller sells to me and I sell to a black person and I get caught doing that, that property doesn't go back to me. It goes back to the seller, the original seller. That's what I call a clawback clause, and they are very common. This is one of the first deeds that has this sort of clause in it, that the discriminatory, what they call a covenant on the deed. And this is from 1903. The grantor, in other words, the seller, sold this piece of land for $1,190. And you can see the physical description of where that is in the John A. Stewart edition to Columbia. Stewart as in, Stewart Road. So this is from 1903. And I believe this is I'm not sure if this property is on the same land as that deed, because as you saw by the physical description, they don't give street names and stuff. They give kind of meets and bounds kind of descriptions, and you have to do a bit of detective work to find out what land that actually is or was. But I know that this house is on land that was restricted at one time. I forget if it's that exact deed or not, but it's an example. It's a modest little home, kind of in a neighborhood of modest homes, and it's the kind of home I think that possibly a black person could have afforded back then, and so it was exactly the kind of home the black people were trying to be kept out of by the interests in town that were trying to do that. This is the home where the grantor on this deed did live. That was John Stewart. That's on Broadway. And here's another example a bit later from 1940. The first time I did this presentation, or a variant of it several years ago, I was trying to find just some random deed that was written by some random person. And I was like, Hill, never heard of them. They're not the Stewarts. They don't have streets named after them. I'll just go with them. And here's the language there. This property shall not be conveyed to, used, owned, nor occupied by my Negro tenants. And there may have been a clawback clause later in there. Sometimes there were, sometimes there weren't. And then there's this whole elaborate description of where that is. Now, when I looked up though, just, where did that person live? The Hills. Well, at the time they wrote that deed in 1940, they were not living in Boone County, but they still own land in Boone County. But check out where they lived in the 1920 census. Taking a look at that, take a look at the very left part, where the vertical writing is. It says University Campus. And then also take a look at whose name appears right below the green part here. Anybody recognize that name?
The one that was hung.
Yeah, that's James Scott.
Yes, the victim of the last lynching in Columbia. So, and there he is in 1920, which would have been the last census in which he would have appeared alive. Right there next to the family of Albert Ross Hill. So I was like, no, that's interesting. Okay, so clearly this was a university person. And sure enough, Hill Hall. If you have an education degree from Mizzou, you probably spent time in Hill Hall. And it's that Hill. It's there's Mrs. Vassy Hill, who also signed on this deed, over on the right at the dedication of that hall in a little bit, about 10 years after this deed was written. So people who sign off on these deeds tend to be who's who type people in Columbia, not only, but they certainly are. And sure enough, when you look at on the census, on the occupation line, he was president of the University of Missouri, not at the time he wrote this deed, but in the time in 1920 when he was living there. There are also institutional actors in these. So there's individuals who sign off on these deeds. This is the Boone County Trust Company, established in the same year as the so far first deed that we found with the racial restriction. It was established in that year by Sanford Hunt and his father-in-law, William Bright. And those are names that appear a lot on these deeds, signing on behalf of this bank. Later on, at the time of the Depression, it seems that many of the deeds that are written to convey the property that is probably getting federal money with Roosevelt's housing programs, that this was the institution that wrote a lot of those mortgages and those deeds. And many of them have restrictive covenants on them. And there are also one of my interns that I had working on this project a few years ago, or a sociology student, discovered that William Bright had also posted the bond for the head of the lynch mob that killed that James T. Scott in 1923.
Wow.
So it's not that this kind of racism is completely separate from the more violent kind of racism. Sometimes it's the same people who are kind of behind the scenes involved in all of this. And later on, that bank merged, and of course there's been many mergers over the years. The building is now occupied by Commerce Bank. And so there's a changing legal situation around the writing of these deeds. Like I say, the first one that we found so far in Boone County is fairly early. When you look at the national scene, I was recently at a conference, and there weren't too many deeds nationally before 1903. So I think Columbia was kind of on the cutting edge of racist deed writing. In 1903. In 1908, I've seen that date given to when J.C. Nichols in Kansas City started building his housing developments and putting covenants on those. Then there was also sort of a parallel thing that was happening where cities are actually writing laws. They couldn't do that for very long, though, because I guess Baltimore was the first to do this in 1910, to start writing the zoning into the law. But then in 1917, there was a Supreme Court case that said, nope, governments can't do that. And that was sort of justified with respect, it wasn't a 14th Amendment case, that was more of a kind of property owners' rights thing, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. But in 1926, there was another Supreme Court case that said private parties, such as developers, can add the racial restrictions in the covenants in the language to the deeds and to the plat map. So that was kind of a way to wiggle around the prohibition on governments doing these things. It's like, no, governments can't do this, but private actors can. So that leads to the 1930s and 40s being kind of peak racist covenant years in the US. Then in 1948, in the famous Shelley v. Kramer case that came out of St. Louis, among other places. I mean, there were a bunch of cases all wrapped up into one in that Supreme Court case, but one of them was out of, the one it was named for was out of St. Louis. Thurgood Marshall argued it. And it made the point that as long as government is involved in enforcing those, because we saw the clawback clauses, right? You know, this ownership got enforced by local governments in some form. The argument was that violates the 14th Amendment, so can't have the government enforcing that. However, that decision did not make them altogether illegal, and I know from other people doing this research in other parts of the country, people did keep writing them. I haven't got that far in the years, you know, in the deeds here, because it's just slow going. It's a lot of deed books to look through, so I don't know yet, you know, how much or if past 1948 they were being written, but they could not be enforced after that point. And then 1968, 20 years after that, the Fair Housing Act makes the covenants outright illegal, but there's still, as we will get to at the end of this presentation, there's still a lot of ways that Black people face discrimination in various ways to do with housing, and one of them is mentioned in some of the literature as being kind of how the Community Reinvestment Act worked out. So but whoops, come on, go forward. There we go. So getting into the professional context of this is a picture of one Philip Kniskern, who became later, under Roosevelt, the head of the Homeowners Loan Corporation for its first 2 years. This is what he wrote in kind of the how to be a realtor. Back. Okay. In sort of the manual of how to be a realtor. This was the time, this early 20th century was the time when realtors were starting to become a profession. And so racism was really, really baked in to the very foundations of the profession of real estate. This was what they were saying. They were, and I've made certain words emphasized here. You've got kind of words like a colored settlement. So that's kind of colonial language, right? Like this is, colored is this category of people who settle a place. Blocks from a white location, which is set off as something separate, like this is a different entity that is claiming this area, right? And then you've got cast its influence upon the latter location, right? You've got this colored settlement casting its influence. And what else gets cast? Well, a shadow, right? And then sure enough, then you've got that language maybe even more explicit, casting their shadow on the particular section. So in other words, it's like, not only do you want blacks and whites not living in the same areas, you don't want them anywhere near each other because there will be a contamination effect. I mean, it's this very sort of almost disease / colonial / military kind of language that's happening here. And it really influences how people think about who they live with and who their neighbors are going to be. And as realtors, like what their responsibility is about kind of determining who's going to be whose neighbors. They see that as their job to keep these groups separate. And so they talk about the mere threat of undesirable encroachment. Again, the colonial / military, encroachment. That's a very military sort of metaphor that we're using there. And we have to watch those metaphors really closely to sort of understand, what the headspace is, the mindset that's being promoted here, and that it could have been different. They didn't have to use that language. Must many times be recognized by a reduced unit value for the house. So they are writing this kind of assumption, this kind of definition of separate areas and their influence on one another, and they're sort of saying, okay, this is going to influence how we economically value this. And this is something that continues, as we will see. Oh, whoops, there we go. And sure enough, in 1936, we see the language continuing. This is the government thing that written in 1936. This was the guidelines for how do you underwrite the loans that go out to the developers to build the housing under the National Housing Act, the housing that's supposed to be there for all Americans, right? But they're talking about, they're using, again, this racist language of adverse influences. And, there must be a favorable condition. They say we're the same deed. They're saying, in order for us, the government, to make a loan to you, the developer, you've got to build in some kind of, quote, protection, kind of, to make sure that there is, quote, a favorable condition that's apt to exist. In other words, you have to keep the black people out or we won't loan the money to you. And again, with the language of the infiltration of, and not only black, but also lower class occupancy. I mean, there were actually covenants written even possibly before and certainly during the time, even in the 19th century, apparently, there were some covenants against, this is where like the prohibitions on raising chickens in yards comes from in some of these developments that get built. That was a class thing, right? The prohibitions on hanging out laundry, and those kinds of things are kind of these aesthetic concerns that are markers of class, obviously, because if raising chickens is something that people who don't have a lot of money to just go buy chicken are doing, and the same with the drying the laundry and stuff. There's this kind of desire to keep certain kinds of people out of certain kinds of places, but with race they just outright say it, you know. And they talk about this incompatible racial and social groups. People are incompatible as neighbors. They're assumed to be incompatible. And again, the language, the military, the invasion, being invaded. And they bring the schools into it as well. They absolutely mean for the schools to be segregated because the surroundings are also segregated. We want to keep the people segregated in every possible way, by also in the schools. So, again, this language of incompatible racial elements, you know, and keep in mind that, you know, races are socially constructed. It's like, and this is sort of making sure that people stay away from each other and that race continues to divide Americans as much as possible. And specifically in this manual, they're talking about, okay, these reasons, the ordinances, the deed restrictions, and they should be good for at least 20 years. It should be mentioned, by the way, that remember in the how many years was that one in 1903? How many years are they talking about? You know, that the X number of years to come. Anybody remember?
Wasn't it 5?
Yes, it was 5. And they're saying in here in 1936, so we better make it at least 20, you know. So it sort of gets worse as the 20th century goes on, is the trend. And and a lot of other kinds of things too. I mean, this thing like the prohibition of the re-subdivision of lots comes in, and the prohibitions against putting those granny pads comes in at this time. I mean, it comes in all together. And again, yeah, the pig pens, the temporary dwellings, the high fences, and oops, what did I meant to go back here? It keeps. Yeah, and G, again, explicitly prohibition of the occupancy of properties except for the race for which they were intended. I mean, it kind of makes these assumptions that race is a static property, that it doesn't get redefined. I mean, if you look at the racial categories in the census and the national origin categories in the census, you can see how socially constructed it is, because they'll change and shift. You know, one year you have octoroons and quadroons and this and that, you know, and you've got the Columbia's first butcher moving up from Louisiana. He was a Creole. They didn't know what to do with that, so they called him black. You know, it's like, it's all, but this document is sort of trying to say, this is how things are, and this is what race people belong to, period. And we're going to make sure that stays a category that defines where people live as well. And they want to make sure it's enforceable, as you see in H. So this is kind of the institutional context nationally in which all of this is happening here locally. And in the professional context as well. You've got, you know, people building race into the real estate profession, and then you've got them also doing it in that national federal government sort of context. And they bring the schools into it as well, and so forth. Here's another example. This one hits close to home, literally, for me. And they do also bring in the sort of paternalistic shall bind and be forever, or no, not forever then, we'll get to that, but shall bind and be for the benefit of the present and all future owners, like including me, of the lots officially conveyed. Well, not quite including me, because this is close to me, but not quite me. But none of said lots shall be sold or rented to anyone other than a member of the white race. And their language is important too, a member of the white race. I mean, you can be a member of the Muleskinners, you can be a member of a fraternity, you can be a member of the League of Women Voters, but a member of the white race, it's like, yeah, and it's sort of exclusive. Like, if you're not a member of this club, you can't get in here. And notice that this deed here is governing one land exchange, but it's sneaking in this other language about all these other lots that are nearby it. So it's kind of like the people who are signing off on this are also signing off on like other people's land too around it, which is kind of odd in a way. This is 1938. By the way, the house on this land is currently for sale. It's like 800 and something $1,000 if you got that in your pocket, being for sale by owner. So it is, it's one of these lots over here. Now, interestingly, these old maps, University does continue like this, but these square streets up here do not exist. This is now Hawthorne Street. The C Street never got built, it was vacated. Rock Hill Road is what they now call Moss. Rock Hill actually ends right about here, and this is my house right here. So if you want me as a neighbor, our house is not selling for almost $1 million, but a couple of these houses along here in Rock Hill, which is part of the Ingleside addition as far as the subdivisions go. A couple of them were covered in that deed. And notice the name on here, Helen Guthrie Miller and William McNabb Miller. Helen Guthrie Miller, any League people here find that name familiar? Any League of Women Voters?
Certainly. I believe she was the woman that received the pen when the governor signed the bill. Is that right?
I had not heard that, but I would not doubt it because she was definitely the founder, or one of the founders of the local Columbia League of Women Voters, as soon as suffrage came along, and was long involved. And she's the only one, by the way, when I look at these deeds, she's the only one whose name appears like Helen Guthrie Miller and husband, instead of, ex-man and wife, which is not always, but on some of them. But the sad thing is, they're restricted covenants that she wrote. So you can be progressive on one thing and very not progressive on the other. Or you could also make the point that at this time, this kind of racist practice was viewed as progressive. I mean, eugenics was viewed as progressive at that time, which is twisted. But it's like never meet your heroes, right? Yeah, it's complicated. And it's like, and you wonder why it can be hard to find Black members of the League of Women Voters in Columbia, if not perhaps elsewhere. So this is one of the houses that was conveyed on that deed. The other one, it sold recently. Yeah, it was many hundreds of thousands of dollars more than what my house would be. And then this other one is the one that was also on that deed, on that property, I think, that was, oh yeah, the asking price for this one when I last looked at it was $721,000, and this other one is like 800 and something thousand. I call it the Peppermint Palace. It has mint green shutters and a great big U-shaped driveway. Yeah, so this is another example. This is Grasslands. If you know anybody who lives in Grasslands, yep, yeah, you had those restrictions on your deed as well. They're not listed. Sometimes you see these on the plat, but sometimes you just see a reference to the restriction on a deed book and page. This is from 1926, and I got to move our pictures down here. Yeah, it says ownership by anyone other than the white race prohibited. It doesn't use the member language, but it's close. It's like none of the lots described in or shown on said plat shall be conveyed, leased, or given to, and no building erected thereon shall be used, owned, or occupied by any person not of the white race. But they have this little carve out for servants. It's okay as long as you're a white person's servant. Then you have Hunt Hill, 1926, similar time period. This is over between Clinkscales and Pershing from west to east, and between Worley and what they call Rocheport Road, in other words, the west extension of Broadway from north to south. And that's also known sometimes as the Columbia and Rocheport Gravel Road at that time. None of the restrictions are written on the plat map, and they're not even referenced on the plat, but when you look at the actual individual deeds in the subdivision, there's boilerplate language. It was used all the time. And this is what that language looks like. And here they're saying not of the Caucasian race. I mean, the language varies a bit. Sometimes they use white, sometimes they try to get all scientific, whatever, and use Caucasian. And of course that's open to debate because people from the actual Caucasus, might who don't look kind of white to some people's viewpoint will take, it actually took people to court over that. So, and I'm not going to read this whole thing out, but it again says that you can institute this is the rat out clause that says neighbors are supposed to rat people out if the neighbor catches somebody selling to somebody of the wrong race, and this is sort of an enforcement thing. And when I was doing study abroad in Germany, it was emphasized to me that a lot of the legal system in the part of Germany where I was really kind of based on neighbors ratting each other out for various things and just always looking at each other's windows and, you know, kind of doing the sort of informal, or kind of converting from informal to formal enforcement of various social norms. And this was similar. Here we've got another one. You can see this is Worley Street going down to Broadhead. This is another area that has covenants on them pretty regularly. Oops, and I have to keep moving my little bars on Zoom. Yeah, this is Western Heights, also 1926, and again, the language appears on the individual deeds rather than on the plat map in any way. And theirs will say, theirs specifies Negro, like you could have people of some other race, but the one they really don't want there is what they called Negro. And there again, you've got the ownership reverting back to the original grantor or their heirs, even if they're no longer alive. So they're thinking long-term here. There we've got Alamo Place in 1928, Hunt, Clinkscale, Spencer. So a lot, anything anywhere near the Ark or the old Gerbs that seems like built in this time is gonna have one of these on it, most likely somewhere. And there again, we see the member of the white race language again. And then here you see this running with the land. And then it starts to be, this is not a 5-year or even a 20-year term. This is forever into the future, is what they were thinking at this point. And then again, and here again, running, and this time it's actually on the plat in this case. And I've blown up the words here a little bit. The following restrictions are made to run with the land and be part of and incorporated in every deed conveying any lot herein described. So it talks about, in the same breath as it talks about an easement for public utilities, they're like, oh, and number 2, none of this is ever going to a black person or a person of African descent. That's a new one. And if you think about it, who could they sell to really? I mean, person of African descent, like go back far enough, you know. And here is 1940 West Ridge subdivision, just west of West Boulevard. And here they again specify Negroes, not even person of Negroes as sort of a separate noun, which may or may not belong to the category human being, and in this conception as owners or tenants.
Can you go back one? Could you go back one for me just quickly?
Sure.
I'm trying to figure the West Ridge. That's West Boulevard, and then what's the next street?
Let me see here.
Can't read it.
South?
Crestland. Okay, and then this is something.
Yeah, this is Ridge Road up here to the north.
Okay. And I can't read this one.
Yeah, that is Crestland. Thank you. Yeah, Avenue. So West Boulevard, and the next one over is Crestland.
Like Rollins to
Rollins. The south. Yeah, Rollins to the south.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rollins up to Ridge. And I've got an actual, were this in person, you could see this, a much better rendered version of this map, where all the little green circles are the subdivisions where I'm finding at least one of these deeds. And a lot of it is around that kind of west, I mean, a lot of it is just based on simply when the things were built. However, it's also important to know that for every deed book that I look through, most of the deeds in there, now granted, there are other kinds of documents in there that aren't warranty deeds where you wouldn't expect to see this kind of stuff, but But even among the warranty deeds, it is a minority of any given deed book is deeds that have these restrictions. So it was clearly a choice. And I'm, historically, we'll see the kinds of questions that I'm asking about this, but it was not the case that like every single deed that was written at this time had them. It's there's choices happening here is, I guess, what I want to say. Yeah, and they are not only in that west area too. I mean, there are some, well, yeah, there's some like two lots away from my house, and there, which is East Campus, and there's some that are over close to Stevens College, and there's some in a few different areas that were in this time period, and I haven't looked at the later ones yet, so that my map does not yet represent the slightly later built subdivisions either. And again, I know that nationally they did keep writing them in even after 1948 when they couldn't any longer be enforced. So what's happening kind of during the peak covenant years nationally?
The Great Depression.
Well, yes, the Great Depression, yes. And Holk comes along to sort of rescue in 1933, and we saw how the racism was written into that. And so you've got people going people going to the cities from the country to get jobs and stuff for World War II, the munitions plants and various other industries. And yeah. So things are happening, and then you have bifurcated results, right? And on the one hand, you've got, especially as a result of all of the restrictions, both in the veterans housing and in the Holk housing, you've got Black people being funneled into rental housing where they have no equity, into physically deteriorating neighborhoods that have been really burdened with a lot of occupancy in the time, when there wasn't the housing available. And you end up with people who just don't have a lot of love or stake for the buildings. You end up with riots, and then there's going to be another kind of financial thing that plays into that side of things that we'll get to a little bit later, which is the whole phenomenon, at least in some cities, especially Chicago, and I'm not sure how widely it was used elsewhere, but there's some of something called the contract for deed. So remember that term as we go on forward. And then on the other hand, though, you've got the white people who are able to move out to the suburbs and are able to get equity, and they're able to get valuable property that increases over time and really start to consider their housing as a kind of investment. They're able to capitalize on that investment, get loans to send their kids to college based on that. And so you've got this, probably the best book that talks about the sort of institutional impacts of this is a fairly slim volume that's called Reproducing Racism. And it's it's by Daria Roithmeyer, who's in, I want to say UCLA or some college in California, a law professor who I tried to get her to come here one time, but that did not happen. But anyway, really good book about sort of how the ongoing effects of these institutional forms of racism continue to have ongoing intergenerational impact long past when the laws were valid in some cases. And then, so other things that are happening a little bit later is, of course, urban renewal. And this is, the yellow line here is the Columbia project as it first started. And there's, so this is June 30th, about this time of year in 1959, and you've got a destruction and a removal of people out of what was then known as the Sharp End. And there's nothing budgeted in there really for, proposed dwelling units, NR. I mean, I forget what that exactly stands for, but it basically means they're not proposing new housing units for all these people getting kicked out. And also notice the families, 14 white families, 303 non-white families. So we have losers, we have winners, or at least we have fewer losers in the white category by a lot. which was absolutely not in keeping with the racial composition of Colombia as a whole. No, it's very clear what is going on here. It's complete disappropriation, just as the Japanese had their property taken away from them. Like that was almost more important in a way than being put in those camps during World War II. It was the same, you know, there was Black home ownership at that time. It was taken away and they were forced into rental. And so that was kind of another way that in Boone County, it was hard to build wealth as a family if you're Black, because, you know, your home is the main way that you do that. This is the area that was affected by that. I really recommend this website here that I got that off of. It's called Renewing Inequality. I think it's out of University of North Carolina or one of those around there. They've done it nationally. They sort of took every urban renewal project and really highlight the racial impact of it, and lots of good stats around it here. So that's our little entry in that. 96% of the families, I mean, that was just, I showed you one page. There were different volumes that also had pages like that, if sort of how that project was going forward each year, because it was a multi-year project too. Yeah, as they say, urban renewal is Black removal, or Negro removal, as I forget which Black person said that, but I think whoever it was on target. Yeah, and then you've got this thing about buying on contract, which really, when I read about the impact of that in Chicago in particular, my jaw was on the floor. What happens with these, and they have different names, and here's an ad from the 60s or 70s here in Colombia for buying a home on contract. It's a little bit like cliques, but for houses. And it has these other names. And kind of the way it works is, and these are still legal, they are very unregulated, and they are still happening. The white speculator buys the property cheaply from a seller who fears the rapidly declining home value, because of course the realtors are all telling them, Black people coming, and they are to sell. So they sell to a buyer who's refused, a Black buyer who has refused a normal bank mortgage for 2 to 4 times the price that the speculator paid. Post 2008, like I say, still happening, even more times the price that the speculator paid. There's also no home inspection required, and you don't get the deed until you've made all the payments. And one missed payment, you lose everything. And speculators had every incentive to get those families to pay like all but the last payment, and then like switch something about the date it's due or the amount that's due, have a balloon payment at the end of it, because they have every incentive to force the families to miss those payments so that the seller can keep the property and start the whole thing again with somebody else. I mean, it's despicable, honestly. It's, I mean, not every kind of contract for deed is that exploitative, but in Chicago, a whole heck of a lot of them were, according to the study that I read about this. In fact, that study said 75 to 95% of homes sold to Black homeowners, home buyers in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s were sold by that means. And in today's dollars, those buyers paid over $500 more per month than they would have paid for a conventional FHA mortgage loan, which they couldn't get. And this is the impact that when whole neighborhoods are sold on that basis, you have no home inspections. The home buyers are stuck with a lot of repair and maintenance. They don't have time to do that repair and maintenance because they have to be holding 2 jobs for both breadwinners in the family in order to make those inflated monthly payments, which they know they can't skip any of. And then, of course, they will subdivide and overcrowd their homes because they need more incomes to feed into that overpriced payment every month. Or they can't afford enough space that they would normally need to house that many people in their family. So you get the overcrowding, of course, further wear and tear on the place, and then they're often stuck because of income or because of like employment discrimination. These people are often stuck in multiple low-end jobs, and they lose time from the home maintenance, from caring for their family, from caring for their community. And you got the local schools, because of the extra people in the space that are sort of unexpected from a city perspective. They're like, oh wait, there's a lot of people here, we got to put more people in that school, more kids in the school, and now we got to have the kids going to school only half days because of too many kids for the school. So you get kids only in school half a day. Like, you kids go to school this half of the day and you kids go to school in the other half of the day. And what does that mean? Bunch of unsupervised kids, because the parents are both working 2 jobs, because they, and so what do you get then? You get gangs, you get, unsupervised kids, you get people needing more income, you get just, kids not being raised by adults in the ways that they maybe should be. And you get, quote, there goes the neighborhood, and you get, quote, dysfunctional culture. It's not culture, it's economics, That was what had my jaw on the floor, just the impact on neighborhoods of this kind of housing discrimination and the kinds of arrangements that people got forced into because other arrangements were closed to them. And so contract for deed today, look who they're marketing it to. Nice mixed race family, bad credit, no problem. Self-employed, no problem. And look who else they're marketing it to. Somali Muslim families in Minnesota. This was a piece on ProPublica a few months ago. And they're pointing out unregulated can be a financial trap. And it just, in some ways, you're better off continuing to rent until you can kind of get like a better deal on buying a home. And there's other ways. This is the new part from my last presentation. There are other ways that real estate discrimination occurs. I mean, just the other day, there's a New York Times story about this woman who is, a molecular biologist. Hello. Being like, there was some 80-year-old white homeowner on the Eastern Shore. No, where was it? It was whatever that, let's see. I kind of keep keep covering up my text with this people bar here. Can I minimize that? Okay, there we go. Yeah, I forget where it was, but it was somewhere on the East Coast and in a shore type of, it was Virginia Beach, that's where it was. Where the seller she actually got caught being discriminating because she literally said to her realtor, oh, this house that I've put under contract to this buyer, I didn't realize that buyer was Black. I'm going to take that back. And they got that pretty much. I mean, they know she said it. And the way that now the realtor's code of ethics is that realtor should have dropped that woman like a hot potato, of the seller. The seller's realtor should have stopped working with her like immediately. Instead, negotiations ensued. And I mean, eventually she did get to, there was lawsuits, or at least threatened lawsuits. There's a whole lot of negotiation, but just all this by way of saying that, a good profession or wealth or anything does not insulate Black people from still facing discriminations from individuals. Now, that's the kind of discrimination that we think about, being from individuals. However, there's other things too at play, such as this. It's pretty major. Property owned by Black people is, study after study proves it, is overassessed and underappraised. So who can explain what's the difference between assessment and appraisal? Because I'm not a real estate person and it's easy to mix up. Like, what happens, what's assessment about? What does that determine?
Assessment is determined by the government, and it's the basis on which they're taxed.
Yes.
And appraisal, I think, just has to do with the sale price or how much of a mortgage you can get.
Yeah, it has to do with like how much, when you're a Black person or when you're a person trying to sell your house, yeah, I don't even fully understand it either, but but it's a realtor thing. I mean, the realtor will take what's called comparable homes that they deem comparable for whatever reason, and are looking at kind of what you can expect to get for the house.
And Rachel, the assessment is a much lower value. It's about a
Yes,
third lower.
yes, yes, definitely. However, if you the one of the studies that I was looking at, this is by state. This is the amount by which either Black or Hispanic residents are being over assessed, like basically overtaxed, essentially, for their house. Okay, so remember what we said about contract for deed in Illinois and how many people, I actually think that is driving this. This is Illinois, number one. It's a big error bar, to be sure. That may just mean that they have low information, not a lot of transparency, I'm thinking. But so I'm not quite sure what that error bar is all about or why they put the dot there, but but Missouri is the one right next to it. So not a good place to be anywhere near Chicago in this case, as far as places where there's kind of discrimination and taxation, like too much tax. And then on the other hand, I didn't get a state by state for the undervaluation of homes in Black neighborhoods. I just got it by year, but it continues. I mean, this is in just raw dollars. According to whatever model this is, Redfin, which is a big real estate website, and they're using US Census numbers. So they're seeing consistently right around 40,000 and sometimes a good deal more. And it's not necessarily going down, it's kind of fluctuating. And in 2021, there's a big uptick again in the undervaluation of homes in Black neighborhoods. So like if you're a Black homeowner, this means you pay higher taxes than you ought to, and you can't sell that home for as much as you ought to be able to sell it for. And every once in a while you see a news item about, hey, yeah, when this Black homeowner like took away all their family pictures, or better yet, had a white friend meet with the realtor and pretend like the house was owned by a white person, then the comps were different, and the price that was come up with for the appraisal was a good deal different, by an average apparently of $55,000 different, which is astounding and something that people still have to deal with today. And finally, there's the whole steering thing. There was a study, really, if you haven't seen this study by Newsday, that website there has got video. I mean, it's got a whole curriculum you can look at. Essentially, they had hundreds of hidden camera video hours and all kinds of data and analysis that you can look at that show just how differently home buyers are treated according to their race. It's like where they're shown the houses, how many house listings they're given, how much, background checking and financial checking gets done to them, whether they are forced to have a pre-approval or not before they'll be worked with. I mean, most often a Black would-be home buyer is subject to a lot more of that kind of scrutiny. And this took place in Staten Island, New York. This is not like some southern hick town or something. This is, it's a national issue. And by the way, the guy, Kniskern, he was from New York as well. So there's just something about New York real estate people and developers. Just putting that out there. No, it is an industry-wide issue. I mean, I don't think it is only a New York problem at all. I mean, we saw Chicago was a big problem, and it's not necessarily only a city problem, but it is a professional real estate problem, as far as I can tell. And they're making efforts within that profession, but people have to keep pushing them. So going back to the history bit, let me see, what time are we? Oh, shoot. Okay. Wow. Almost done. Well, I guess basically, if you want to help me with this, contact me and I can help you do that. Those are some things about, these are the research questions that I have to do with the dirty deeds, what the kind of things that I'm trying to answer. And let's see, and some possible policy remedies. There's a really good book called Just Action that talks about policy remedies. And if you want a book club read, I highly recommend it. Yeah, and a bit of bibliography and let's see, a little bit of further. Oh yeah, there it is, the book Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under Color of Law. And that's for all of whatever 2-minute discussion may be left. Or I can also take questions.
Rachel, do you want to say something about when the Battle family came here and the area that they started, that neighborhood?
I am not as familiar with that. I think there are definitely people in this community who know that story a lot better than I do. I've been very kind of focused on flipping
Yeah.
through those deed books and just kind of surfacing the covenants as I find them one by one. But no, I know that they did, and it wasn't only them, of course. And there was somebody else who's there was recently a recognition sometime in the past year of, what was that place? It's kind of off of Worley. It was a whole, block or two that was meant as sort of a middle class Black development, homeowners and stuff, sort of early attempts to really nurture Black home ownership in that area.
Their neighborhood is off of Stadium Boulevard.
Okay. Yeah, that would have been.
This was before that.
Yeah, that was,
What you're referring is before that.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, that's further ahead in time, in the 50s or 60s, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, because they also, of course, as integrators of the schools, that would have been a little bit after Brown v. Board, which was 54. So yeah, late 50s.
Right. Yeah.
Sue or Herb have a question?
I was just going to make a couple of comments. One, I lived in Chicago 51 to 54, and I can remember right in Hyde Park, right on the University of Chicago campus. And I can remember kids coming to school and say, a Black moved into our building and we'll be moving soon.
Wow.
And I lived on 59th Street, 660 on the other side of the Midway, south, turned pretty strongly at African-American while I lived there. Hyde Park, I talked to a mother of one of my friends. I talked to her in 62. She said what happened to Hyde Park was the University of Missouri, University of Chicago, that area got so highly African-American that the university decided they had to buy up much of the land, or they were going to have to move they felt they'd have to move as a college. I will also say when I was looking at property in 1974 here in Columbia, I was shocked to find a standalone, I had never seen this, standalone toilet in the basement over in the university area in an apartment, in that house. I asked, what was that for the Black help? No sink, no curtains, windows in the place. And I just I'd never heard of that even being done. Wow. And Herb had a quick question.
Okay. In this wonderful 20th century, wonderful in quotation marks, 20th century story of Columbia and Boone County, would you add a few words about Three Creeks Township in the late 19th and early 20th century, a story I know you know, and its effect upon what followed? That's just south and east of town.
Sorry, let's see, yeah, I really don't know. If I did at one time, I have forgotten. I am sorry.
That was a place where freed slaves were given land they could own, just south of Columbia, the worst land in the area. And folks who tried to farm it ended up moving to Columbia in the late 19th and 20th century. Stimulus, I think, for the stories that you're telling.
Well, I guess I want to push back against the idea that the problem that leads to discrimination is Black people being there in a
No,
city.
no, that's not the point.
Okay.
But anyway, there's a wonderful thesis that was written here under direction of Arva Strickland. There's a story about the Three Creeks in the Missouri Historical Review. You can look it up. But the people who were moving in were not coming from everywhere. They were coming particularly from Three Creeks.
Yeah, thank you. See, I think I see Carl's got a hand.
Carl?
Or Mari.
I think Mari might have a question too, but I just wanted to mention, first of all, thanks for being here. It's great work, and all of this is very reminiscent of me growing up in the Chicago area. I was born in 1946 and I lived there through 64 in high school. So I was there. We were part of the white flight to the suburbs, if you will. And my parents were racist, and you're absolutely right about the insidiousness and racism that was rampant in Chicago. But you've given us a wealth of resources to take a look at some of this stuff. Let me offer one to you as well. You may be familiar with it. And that is, while I was on the city council, I was also a many years long member of the Race, Equity, and Leadership Council, which was part of the NLC.org, and some of the discussions and a lot of the work involving redlining. And as a matter of fact, there was a redlining exhibit, an exhibit that was an amazing thing. And some of the discussions yielded the same kinds of information and a wealth of information from their resource library that may be very useful to you and perhaps some of the folks in Muleskinners. So let me defer
Absolutely.
to
So you say nlc.org?
NLC.org, and they have a library of resources that are available to the public, but the city is a member of that organization anyway. But that includes that panel, that Race, Equity, and Leadership panel, which is doing a lot of the work and really discussing some of the issues as far ranging as reparations and all the rest of it, to try and restore some of these rights that were taken away.
Oh, yeah. And there's definitely, when I was on the Zoom with a bunch of other people who study these covenants, there is a movement, at least in one or two Western cities, like out, I mean, the whole states of like Oregon and Washington have some serious racism just written into, like, this is going to be a whites only place, you know. But anyway, they're trying to tie some reparations to, like, families who lived in those places at this time. I mean, to me, it's a much more feasible kind of reparations than like reparations for slavery.
Right.
Because you've got so many generations between slavery and now, and not that many between these covenants and now, and you got names, you know.
And that really has to do with equity and all the rest. It gets to the issue of the land and equity and all those kinds of things. Even post-war, Civil War, the promise of land that was given back to the South for at that period of time, back to the folks that were supposedly vanquished, never got to the slaves.
Yeah, with Lincoln's death, that's whole 40 acres and a mule thing kind of.
Johnson took it back.
My comment or question also has to do with the book I read recently. It's been out for several years, but it's really excellent. I would recommend it, called The Warmth of Other Suns. And
Yes,
it's
love
about
it.
the Great Migration from the South to the North. But
Yes.
she talks about how, to the point Sue was making about how neighborhoods would empty out all of a sudden. That was a deliberate ploy on the part of the real estate industry.
Money,
Because
they laughed all the way to
as
the
a
bank.
Black family would move into a neighborhood, the real estate agents would show up, knock on the doors, say, you got to get out now before your property values drop.
Well, they would hire Black women to drive around there with baby carriages. I mean,
I grew up in
and
Detroit.
scare
I grew up in
people into the suburbs and then purchase those houses and do the deed thing that you described, so they could get a lot more money from
In
the
Detroit in the 50s and 60s, when I grew up, in the middle to later 60s especially, the real estate companies would hire kids to go around with flyers and say, this is almost a quote, they're coming. They didn't say colored people. are coming, and they would say, you know, they're already up to this street. Sell now before your real estate, and they'd make a killing on all these sales. And within 5 years, entire neighborhoods would be, you know, there'd be like people who had lived there for 30 and 40 years were just gone. And there'd be 3 or 4 of the original residents left as African Americans started moving in. And it was instantaneous, and it was instigated by the real estate companies. It was quite devastating to the city.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, it was interesting. I mean, my own background growing up, well, my parents met, first of all, at the University of Chicago. They were there in the late 60s, and I think lived in some of that land that did get bought up by that university. So it's that the whole thing is an interesting connection. But I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland. I was in a very integrated public school. I mean, it was literally 1/4 of each, whatever you'd kind of loosely call a race, you know, but white, black. I mean, Hispanic's not a race, but like people from Latin America, a lot of Salvadorans there, but not only, and people from various Asian countries, a lot of Korean Americans, a lot of Vietnamese, kind of right off the boat people, and different kinds of Asian Americans, and it just always, and my neighborhood was maybe not. Well, it was pretty integrated, but not as integrated as my school was. And I remember even at the time, like in school newspapers, kids were writing in the school newspapers about the inequities and funding of schools that were more of one or another race. And then later I lived in Brooklyn, New York, in an area, it was a street where they filmed Sophie's Choice. It used to be very Jewish, and it had become sort of part still Jewish, but also a lot of Caribbean immigrants. It was very vibrant. I was there in a time coming off of the really high crime years of the early 90s. It was kind of falling off a bit by that time, by the late 90s when I was there. But in that neighborhood, there was a book about the neighborhoods of New York that I found really interesting that was sort of talking about how that neighborhood really consciously tried to stay multiracial, and that it wasn't easy, that there was a lot of sort of action needed to make sure that gentrification didn't overtake everything and shove out all the people who weren't white or weren't wealthy. And I mean, actually, some amount of gentrification did happen, because like when I last visited there, I couldn't afford to live there anymore. But it was still racially diverse, though. So that was good. I mean, but I really got the idea that keeping a diverse neighborhood, especially, you know, in the context of America and the kinds of fears that, not the least, realtors are pushing on people, but also the media and the real effects of things like that contract for deed, and that, you know, that the kinds of effects of the overcrowding and stuff that people mistake for the effects of culture. Right. I mean, and you get books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and people are always putting things down to, oh, well, Black people just can't save money. It's like, well, maybe because they get forced into housing where and they get under assessed or under appraised and over assessed. And, you know, it's like, yeah, it's just, you have to work at things a bit to keep an integrated neighborhood. I believe it is when you're lucky enough to have one. But I believe it's something worth doing.
Rachel, really appreciate your presentation. I grew up partly in Baltimore, and I heard the same kind of stories that Dave was talking about Detroit. So it's just amazing how much of this occurred even without even talking about redlining. The depth of the discrimination through all kinds of different means. So really appreciate your being here today, and good luck with continuing with your research.
Yeah,
Thank you. And just and you somebody who's got my email address. If anybody wants to flip through some deed books, even electronically, please let me know. I can always use more volunteers to surface those things.
Okay, before you leave, Rachel, I want to bring up that we lost one of our members this week who was also a member of the League of Women Voters. It's
Oh.
Joni O'Connor's husband, John O'Connor.
Oh, gosh.
And I thought
Yeah.
many of you knew him. So we will miss him a lot.
And did anyone know Byron Smith?
I heard
Yes.
his.
Brian
Yeah,
Smith
we
was
lost him
very
too.
good for our community. It's really sad.
Couple of big losses this week.
Amazing
Yeah,
work.
it really was.
So thanks for having me, and I'll see you another time.
Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, good to see you,
Thanks.
Rachel.
Pam, do you have some announcements for us?
I do.